I'm in business. So as Emily so wonderfully introduced, my name is Trevor Klein. I'm the OSM Vista Coordinator for the Kerber Creek Restoration Project in Saguache, Colorado. I apologize if I speak quickly. I haven't quite discarded my East Coast mentality yet. So just before I start, I really want to recognize Steve Sanchez, who now works for the Forest Service, but used to work for the BLM and was kind of the project manager on Kerber Creek. He really helped me put together this presentation, so it was really an invaluable resource. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the Kerber Creek Watershed, it's located in the San Luis Creek Watershed, which is in kind of the northeast corner of the Rio Grande Watershed. And it's also located in the closed basin of the Rio Grande watershed. So it theoretically recharges the Rio Grande via subsurface flow. And a little bit more specifically, the Kerber Creek watershed begins just northeast of Villa Grove, which is kind of the northernmost town on the 285, going towards Concha Pass.
I'm getting some weird feedback. Are you guys also hearing that?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Let's just switch. Where's our mic? Oh, okay.
Looks like my attempt to revive the headset did not pick up. My apologies.
Good effort.
So it begins just northeast of the town of Villa Grove, as I mentioned, and it extends north into the Rio Grande National Forest and includes the town of Bonanza, which is the smallest incorporated town in Colorado with a population between 10 and 16. It does have a mayor, though. So the Kerber Creek Restoration Project, we're kind of a non-legal entity collaboration to sustain the health of this watershed and to restore the health of the watershed through collaborative restoration projects and community education. This is sort of an iconic list of our partners. I'll talk more about each one kind of throughout the presentation, but this is not all-inclusive. We work with a number of different organizations throughout the San Luis Valley and throughout the state. Okay. So this is kind of my framework for the presentation. I'm calling it kind of the guide to collaborative restoration, if you will. I like to structure things in this kind of hierarchical manner. So we're going to start with knowing your site, which in this case was pretty crucial because there's a lot of history in the Kerber Creek watershed. So mining kind of occurred between the 1880s and the 1970s. The majority of that mining occurred in the 1920s and 1930s at a mine called the Raleigh 12. Mainly silver, lead, zinc, and copper. Also some gold mines, particularly in the lower watershed. I believe that picture in the bottom left is a picture of the Raleigh 12 mine kind of in the tunnels that were used to mine. And this picture on the right is one of the old tailings dams or impoundments behind which tailings and mine waste were actually collected and consolidated in these upper watershed tributaries. These dams were destroyed by flood events and were kind of breached by flood events in the mid-20th century, carrying tailings downstream and depositing them along Kerber Creek. There's also some talk that those dams were actually destroyed by the state and by ranchers as well. This is a picture of Kerber Creek in 1975. It was taken by BLM staff who were conducting a riparian assessment of the San Luis Valley. Really degraded, tailings everywhere. As you can clearly see, I think this is a really great picture, and BLM staff actually said that the stream was a mess, really technical term. So initial efforts, the Kerber Creek Restoration Project was really lucky because about $10 million was invested in the project before it even started. So in the 1990s. So in 1991, it was investigated as for potential Superfund designation. It was approved for Superfund designation, but it never actually took it. So instead, the Bonanza Group, which was a collaboration among the American Smelting and Refining Company, as well as the U.S. Forest Service, BLM, and local landowners, decided to engage in voluntary cleanup efforts, one of the first of its kind in Colorado, actually. So tons of restoration projects were implemented between 1994 and 1999. Those were kind of the big ones, installing bulkheads, creating this large repository in which tons of tailings, hundreds of thousands of tons of tailings and mine waste were actually consolidated and capped and lined. Unfortunately, in 2002, the American Smelting and Refining Company went bankrupt, so that essentially cut off all funding for these kinds of projects. But actually, let me go back. This is a picture of the Raleigh 12 before restoration occurred. That's the draining adit. And this is what it looks like now, in 2012. So a big bulkhead was installed right there. This is Squirrel Creek, which is just downstream of that bulkhead. Huge tailings deposit, lots of mine waste. That was actually the first picture that I showed of that tailings dam. It was just downstream of that site. This is a picture from a different angle at the same site. That's what Squirrel Creek looks like today. All the work of American Smelting and Refining Company. So, now that we know kind of what happened on the site, we need to identify needs, right? So in 1998, the BLM completed a proper functioning conditioning assessment on the riparian area of Skunk Creek, which is an upper watershed tributary to Kerber Creek. And they realized that there was a lot of work that still needed to be done, particularly in the lower watershed. So in 2005, they began characterizing parts of the upper watershed, about 5 miles from Bonanza to about 5 miles downstream of that, mainly because that was the only place where there was any public land along the stream. They quickly realized that most of the tailings deposits, most of the mine waste were located on private land downstream, so they realized that they needed a way to use federal funds on these private lands to actually start engaging landowners. So there are a couple of considerations. First of all, getting the consent and some of the legal issues that go into this. So we'll start with some of the legal issues. This is a bullet point I don't know too much about, but I know that private entities were reluctant to engage in restoration due to liability concerns. The bigger one, though, is that the BLM needed a way to use federal funds on private land. So what they did is they had to go to the state director and get approval to use the Wyden Amendment, which allowed federal funds to be implemented for restoration projects on private land as long as there was an imminent threat to public health and the environment or public land. So this is actually a picture of one of the landowners who worked with us. In terms of notifying landowners, that man I mentioned at the beginning, Steve Sanchez, went door to door from 2005 to 2006 requesting access to landowners' properties. There were over 100 landowners in the watershed at the time, so it was quite a big undertaking. He managed to get most of the landowners to agree to provide access by about 2007, although not all. Another picture of just some people working with local landowners. This is a slide I always like to show at these kinds of conferences because it gets everyone kind of on the same page in terms of what we're talking about, the environmental threats in this watershed. So 2 major things to discuss: the deposition of contaminated sediment in the lower watershed and the contribution of contaminated flow from those upper watershed source areas, the draining adits, the abandoned mine lands, etc. So obviously the deposition of contaminated sediment leads to phytotoxic soil conditions in riparian areas, which subsequently leads to plant death. Both the deposition of contaminated sediment and the contribution of contaminated flow contribute to downstream water quality issues. And in 2006, Kerber Creek was listed on the 303D list of impaired water bodies for a number of different variables. I think it was 5 different metals. So obviously the instability of stream banks is caused by this loss of riparian vegetation, and the combination of these 2 things, contaminated surface water and the instability of stream banks, making the width to depth ratio increase rather than stay where it should be. This altered geomorphology leads to poor fishery and macroinvertebrate habitat. So one of the ecological goals for this project would be to improve that habitat, right? So here's kind of what happened next, right? So this is an environmental assessment was completed on the entire watershed in 2006, and 2 alternative kind of cleanup options were suggested. So the first was the relocation or treatment of mine waste deposits, which I'll talk about in a little bit, and stream bank restoration and channel stabilization. So the idea was to approach it from both angles, right? So now that we've identified needs, we need people to kind of actually satisfy those needs, so we build partnerships. So environmental restoration is this multidisciplinary, open, rapidly changing process. There are a lot of people talking about a lot of different things kind of all at the same time, right? So the idea was to get all of those people involved and to really kind of merge efforts to improve this watershed. So we started with government agencies because this was largely a BLM-led project. So we involved the U.S. Forest Service, the Fish and Wildlife Service, and one of our most crucial partners was actually the Natural Resources Conservation Service, and I'll talk more about how they're crucial in a bit. We also worked with Trout Unlimited because Trout Unlimited is this huge organization that can provide tons of project management oversight and can serve as a fiscal agent for some of those really large $100,000, $200,000, $500,000 grants. So, OSM Vista program as well, I wanted to just mention that a little bit. So that's a program that I work for, and the idea with the OSM Vista program was to kind of expand the scope of the project and to ensure that it was as sustainable as possible. Through capacity building, providing kind of a full-time project coordinator and education programs. So the idea was to integrate environmental restoration with economic vitality. So kind of in this depressed region, the San Luis Valley, try to kind of connect those 2 efforts that were going on simultaneously through various organizations. A few pictures of, we've actually had 5 OSM Vistas on the project since its inception in 2008. We've built partnerships, now we need money, right, to actually implement projects. So one of our biggest funding sources is the Colorado Non-Point Source Program, and I'm sure there are a number of organizations that use that program to fund the work that they do. We've received a total of over $800,000 from the Colorado Non-Point Source Program through 2 different grants, actually 3 different grants. But there are a lot of other partners that go into funding our project as well. So we've got tons of federal matching funds come from the BLM. They actually provided over $130,000 of source money at the beginning of the project. And I want to highlight the Natural Resources Conservation Service. In total, they've contributed over $500,000 to the project through engineering and implementation of in-stream restoration. We've had a lot of help from state organizations as well, the Colorado State Forest Service, Division of Reclamation, Mining, and Safety, and private foundations, Commission for Environmental Cooperation, Excel Energy, and most recently the Norcross Wildlife Foundation. We also have had tons of in-kind donations as well from landowners, volunteer groups, and making sure that we really take into account all of the different in-kind donations that come in, meetings, internship programs, materials that have been donated by landowners, etc. So now, kind of implementation methods. So what do we do with all this money? And so this is one of the unique aspects of the project, how we identified priority restoration areas. So the kind of standard practices in this kind of large-scale stream restoration, watershed restoration project would be to implement projects upstream to downstream for a variety of reasons. So it would kind of look like this. All those pink properties are private properties. I believe the stream is about 95% privately owned, at least in the lower watershed. Kerber Creek didn't do that. We implemented projects on a landowner consent basis. So we jumped from the upper watershed to the lower watershed and back up, just kind of all over the place to get as much work done as fast as possible. Right now we're working in that dark blue area. That's actually the largest privately owned parcel of land in the watershed. In terms of our methods, so our in-stream restoration methods follow kind of a Roskin-style stream structure. And also include reshaping of banks and regrading those banks to a 3-to-1 slope. So something that looked like that originally now looks like that. So we really are pulling back those banks, we're stabilizing them with these rock structures, large root wads, willows, etc. Our mine waste treatment method is pretty unique. Originally there were 200 acres of mine waste deposited throughout the lower watershed, and basically removing all of those and putting them into a repository was not cost effective. So instead we use a method that we term in situ phytostabilization. So that treatment method will turn something like that into this, and it involves incorporation of soil amendments that both reduce the acidity of the soil and bind the heavy metals in an organic amendment that allow for revegetation. And we also install erosion control structures to make sure that our investment is protected. So, another really crucial part of all of these kinds of projects is measuring success, right? So ensuring that what we've actually done is having some kind of measurable effect. So I want to just highlight the quote that's in that top right corner. This was from a paper by Bernard and others in 2005 stating that only about 46% of stream restoration projects in this state engaged in any monitoring activity. That was a number of years ago, of course, and things have changed since then. But monitoring is really important for a number of reasons, and we engage in both water quality monitoring and a variety of environmental monitoring, including vegetation, aquatic life, with depth ratio, and sinuosity. Here are just a few pictures of those monitoring efforts. That is actually a BLM hydrologist working with some of our interns in 2012 to monitor with depth ratio. We measure sinuosity remotely. That's actually not an accurate representation of how we do it these days, but that was how we did it in 2009. And this is a great picture because it really kind of takes into account all of the different people who work on these kinds of monitoring efforts. This was this fish population monitoring event was a combination of Fish and Wildlife Service, Trout Unlimited, local interns, volunteers, all working on this fish shocking to ensure that our fish population was improving. So another thing that I just wanted to talk about a little bit was this idea of land reclamation, right? The way that land has changed. Land use has changed in the Kerber Creek watershed from the early 20th century when there was this huge industrial kind of spirit in the watershed, this mining activity that went on in the upper watershed, to the 1970s and 1990s when we really saw the effects of that industrial land use, the limited technology that was available causing this kind of environmental degradation, to what it looks like now, which is a pretty functioning system ecologically speaking. And some of the ways that we use that land today, we engage in public watershed tours that are open to a lot of different groups. environmental education efforts. We work really closely with an organization called the Rio Grande Watershed Conservation and Education Initiative, which is pretty well known in the San Luis Valley and actually has engaged a lot of local students in science fair projects in the watershed. We provide opportunities for youth in the San Luis Valley and students to gain experience through volunteering opportunities and internships. And there's also an improved ability for people to engage in recreation and just kind of appreciation of the environment and appreciation of the effort that it takes to revive an environment that has been negatively impacted by historic mining activities. So these are just a few pictures of some of these different events that we've held. This one is the most recent, our tour with Trout Unlimited in 2012, which was a really great success and actually kind of combined about 30 of our partners, 30 representatives from about 10 different partnering organizations. It's really good. The other important part of this kind of guide is considering lessons learned. So we've accomplished a lot, but we also recognize that there are ways that we could have done it better, right? So here's just a list of our accomplishments. Since 2007, we've treated close to 60 acres of mine waste. We've installed hundreds of rock structures throughout the watershed. We've restored well over 4,000 feet of stream bank. Actually, most recently, we restored an additional 2,500, so that number should be more like 6,000. And we've attracted over 13,000 hours of volunteers and over $2 million in grants. So it's been a really successful project. We've had 6 different awards in the last few years. It's pretty impressive for a project that only really began in 2007, 2008. But there are successes and mistakes, right? So some of our successes, speaking directly with landowners, going door to door, one-to-one, on a one-to-one basis before holding kind of a larger stakeholders meeting, recognizing that different landowners have different experiences. We've got landowners who are retired teachers, landowners who are practicing civil engineers, things. So it was really important that we explain everything on a level that was applicable to each landowner and not kind of group them together, at least initially. Now we have larger stakeholders meetings. We work collaboratively with a number of different organizations, which helps the project kind of expand in scope and also get as much done as possible. We based work on landowner participation. Rather than working upstream to downstream, we just worked with whoever was willing to work with us first, whoever was ready, which helped us get as much work done as we have in the last few years. We've taken every opportunity presented, and what that means is if we have a volunteer group who says, we want to volunteer on your project for a week in the next 2 months, we just kind of find a project for them. And part of the reason that we do that is both to engage as many people in the project as possible and to get those in-kind hours that are so important when you're doing things like grant writing. We've also recognized our limitations. There are tons of abandoned mines in the Bonanza Mining District. From the upper kind of Rawling mines, there's a huge draining adit that's still contributing contaminated flow. We're trying to work on them, but we also recognize that some of those might not be possible to work on from a cost perspective, from kind of a practical perspective, and that might be okay from an ecological perspective too. In terms of our mistakes, we haven't publicized the project as widely as we could have in terms of working on a regional scale. Not everyone in the southern San Luis Valley knows much about what's going on in the northern valley more generally. Another thing, actually, this came directly from Steve Sanchez. Ask big, downsize later in terms of grants. So rather than asking for as little money as possible to get just the amount of work done that we need, we could have asked for a lot more money and then downsized based on the amount of money that we received. Working regionally and locally, sometimes we've not necessarily engaged as many different groups as possible from the San Luis Valley, partly because of the kind of local scope of the project and partly because of time. Emphasizing connectivity, and what I mean by that is kind of on a larger scale, upper watershed areas in the Rio Grande watershed, for example, affect everything that goes on downstream, even if all you're doing is reconnecting a stream to its floodplain and improving groundwater recharge. That's something that we haven't necessarily emphasized, and that's probably limited our ability to expand into the southern San Luis Valley to a certain extent. And long-term management plans, and I put a question mark at the end of that because some people would say, when you're working directly with landowners, you need to ensure that the landowners are willing to protect the investment in the long term. Others might say that that's going to inhibit their interest in participating at the beginning. So we've had some experience with landowners who haven't necessarily done the things that need to be done to protect the investment that we've made on the project. So that's kind of an issue that we can talk about more. Here's just a list of some of our future and upcoming projects that we're working on. Working on a community kitchen in Saguache based on kind of the Taos Community Kitchen. A few new tour offerings. We're revitalizing partnerships with some groups in the upper San Luis Valley. We're also engaging in two kind of original studies. One is on the effects of restoration on depth of groundwater table with the BLM Adams State University intern. And this is actually the next conference that I'm going to, which is the Wyoming Reclamation and Restoration Symposium. We did a big we did a study of the effects of restoration kind of from a statistical perspective. It's pretty interesting. So thank you so much for listening and bearing with me. And I hope you enjoyed that presentation.